Alright. Power's at least back on. How are y'all doing? Probably would help if I was on the right, wait. Just because I don't know
Oh, yeah.
when my power's gonna, if power's gonna cut back out. So.
Good. All signed and sealed. Now, let's begin the transfusion. Oh, don't you worry. Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
Prepare. What are you still doing here?
your fault. crags of Telnair, Saphira flew low over the swaying forest until she arrived at the clearing wherein stood the Menoa tree. Thicker than 100 of the giant pines that encircled it, the Menoa tree rose toward the sky like a mighty pillar, its arching canopy thousands of feet across. The gnarled net of its roots radiated outward from the massive, moss-bound trunk, covering more than 10 acres of forest floor before the roots delved deeper into the soft soil and vanished beneath those of lesser trees. Close to the Menoa tree, the air was moist and cool, and a faint but constant mist drifted down from the mesh of needles above, watering the broad ferns clustered about the base of its trunk. Red squirrels raced along the branches of the ancient tree, and the bright calls and chirrups of hundreds of birds burst forth from the bramble-like depths of its foliage. And throughout the clearing, the sense of a watchful presence pervaded, for the tree contained within it the remnants of the elf once known as Linnea, whose consciousness now guided the growth of the tree and that of the forest beyond. Aragon searched the uneven field of roots for any sign of a weapon, but as before, he found no object he would consider carrying into battle. He pried a loose slab of bark from the moss at his feet and held it up to Saphira. "What do you think?" he asked. "If I imbued it with enough spells, could I kill a soldier with this?" "You could kill a soldier with a blade of grass if you wanted to," she answered. "However, against Murda and Thorn, or the king and his black dragon, you might as well attack them with a strand of wet wool as that bark." "You're right," he said, and tossed it away. "It seems to me," she said, "that you should not need to make a fool of yourself in order for Solembum's advice to prove true." "No, but perhaps I should approach the problem differently if I am going to find this weapon. As you pointed out before, it could just as easily be a stone or a book as a blade of some sort. A staff carved from the branch of the Menoa tree would be a worthy weapon, I would think. But hardly equal to a sword. No, and I would not dare lop off a branch without permission from the tree herself, and I have no idea how I could go about convincing her to grant my request." Saphira arched her sinuous neck and gazed upward at the tree, then shook her head and shoulders to rid herself of the droplets that had accumulated on the sharp edges of her faceted scales. As the spray of cold water struck him, Aragon yelped and jumped backward, shielding his face with his arm. "If any creature tried to harm the Menoa tree," she said, "I doubt they would live long enough to regret their mistake." For several more hours, the two of them prowled the clearing. Aragon continued to hope they would stumble across some nook or cranny among the knotted roots where they would find the exposed corner of a buried chest, which would contain a sword. Since Murda has Zara, which is his father's sword, Aragon thought, by all rights, I ought to have the sword Runan made for Brahm. It would be the right color too, Saphira added. His dragon, my namesake, was blue as well. At last, in desperation, Aragon reached out with his mind toward the Menoa tree and attempted to attract the attention of her slow-moving consciousness, to explain his search and ask for her help. But he might as well have been trying to communicate with the wind or the rain, for the tree took no more notice of him than he would of an ant flailing its feelers by his boots. Disappointed, he and Saphira left the Menoa tree even as the rim of the sun kissed the horizon. From the clearing, Saphira flew to the center of Elsmera, where she glided to a landing within the bedroom of the treehouse the elves had given them to stay in. The house was a cluster of several globular rooms that rested in the crown of a sturdy tree, several hundred feet above the ground. A meal of fruit, vegetables, cooked beans, and bread was waiting for Aragon in the dining room. After eating a little, Aragon curled up next to Saphira on the blanket-lined basin set into the floor, ignoring the bed in preference for Saphira's company. He lay there, alert and aware of his surroundings, while Saphira sank into a deep sleep. From his place by her side, Aragon watched the stars rise and set above the moonlit forest and thought of Brahm and the mystery of his mother. Late in the night, he slipped into the trance-like state of his waking dreams, and there he spoke with his parents. Aragon could not hear what they said. His voice and theirs were muted and indistinct, but somehow he was aware of the love and pride his parents felt for him, and although he knew they were no more than phantoms of his restless mind, ever after he treasured the memory of their affection. At dawn, a slim elf maid led Aragon and Saphira through the paths of Elsmera to the compound of the family Valtharos. As they passed between the dark boles of the gloomy pines, it struck Aragon how very empty and quiet the city was compared with their last visit. He descried only 3 elves among the trees, tall, graceful figures who glided away on silent footsteps. When the elves marched to war, Saphira observed, few remained behind. Lord Fioler was waiting for them inside an arched hall illuminated by several floating lights. His face was long and stern and angled more sharply than those of most elves, so that his features reminded Aragon of a thin-bladed spear. He wore a robe of green and gold, the collar of which flared high behind his head, like the neck feathers of an exotic bird. In his left hand, he carried a wand of white wood carved with glyphs from the Lijuan Kaviti. Mounted upon the end was a lustrous pearl. Bending at the waist, Lord Fëanor bowed, as did Aragon. Then they exchanged the elves' traditional greetings, and Aragon thanked the Lord for being so generous as to allow him to inspect the sword Tamerlane. And Lord Fëanor said, "Long has Tamerlane been a prized possession of my family, and it is especially dear to my own heart. Know you the history of Tamerlane, Shadeslayer?" "No," said Aragon. "My maid was the most wise and fair Nadra, and her brother, Arba, was a dragon rider at the time of the fall. Nadra was visiting with him in Illyria when Galbatorix and the Forsworn did sweep down upon the city like a storm from the north. Arba fought alongside the other riders to defend Illyria, but Keolandi of the Forsworn dealt him a mortal blow. As he lay dying on the battlements of Illyria, Arba gave his sword, Tamerlane, to Nadra that she might protect herself. When Tamerlane, dragon and rider, although she died soon afterward of her wounds. With a single finger, Lord Fëanor stroked the wand, eliciting a soft blow from the pearl in response. "Tamerlane is as precious to me as the air in my lungs. I would sooner part with life than part with it. Unfortunately, neither I nor my kin are worthy of wielding it. Tamerlane was forged for a rider, and riders we are not. I am willing to lend you it, Shadeslayer, in order to aid you in your fight against Galbatorix. However, Tamerlane will remain the property of House Valtharos, and you must promise to return the sword if ever I or my heirs ask for it." Aragon gave his word, and then Lord Fëanor led him and Saphira to a long, polished table grown out of the living wood of the floor. At one end of the table was an ornate stand, and resting upon the stand was the sword Tamerlane in its sheath. The blade of Tamerlane was colored a dark, rich green, as was its sheath. A large emerald adorned the pommel. The furniture of the sword had been wrought of blued steel. A line of glyphs adorned the cross guard. In Elvish, they said, "I am Tamerlane, bringer of the final sleep." In length, the sword was equal to Zarok, but the blade was wider and the tip rounder and the build of the hilt was heavier. It was a beautiful, deadly weapon, but just by looking at it, Aragon could see that Runen had forged Tamerlane for a person with a fighting style different from his own, a style that relied more on cutting and slashing than the faster, more elegant techniques Brahm had taught him. As soon as Aragon's fingers closed around Tamerlane's hilt, he realized that the hilt was too large for his hand, and at that moment he knew that Tamerlane was not the sword for him. It did not feel like an extension of his arm, as had Zarok. And yet, despite his realization, Aragon hesitated, for where else could he hope to find so fine a sword? Arvinder, the other blade Oromas had mentioned, lay in a city hundreds of miles distant. Then Saphira said, "Do not take it. If you were to carry a sword into battle, with your life and mine to depend upon it, then the sword must be perfect. Nothing else will suffice. Besides, I do not like the conditions Lord Fëanor has attached to his gift." And so Aragon replaced Tamerlane on its stand and apologized to Lord Fëanor, explaining why he could not accept the sword. The narrow-faced elf did not appear overly disappointed. To the contrary, Aragon thought he saw a flash of satisfaction appear in Fëanor's fierce eyes. From the halls of the family Valtharos, Aragon and Saphira made their own way through the dim caverns of the forest to the tunnel of dogwood trees that led to the open atrium in the center of Runen's house. As they emerged from the tunnel, Aragon heard the clink of a hammer on a chisel, and he saw Runen sitting at a bench by the open-walled forge in the middle of the atrium. The elf woman was busy carving a block of polished steel that lay before her. Whatever she was sculpting, Aragon could not guess, for the piece was still rough and indistinct. "So, Shadeslayer, you are still alive," said Runen, without taking her eyes off her work. Her voice grated like pitted millstones. "Oromas told me that you lost Zarok to the son of Morzin." Aragon winced and nodded, even though she was not looking at him. "Yes, Runen Elda. He took it from me on the burning plains." HMPH. Runen concentrated on her hammering, tapping the back of her chisel with inhuman speed. Then she paused and said, "The sword has found its rightful owner, then. I do not like the use to which, what is his name?" "Ah yes, Murtaugh is putting Zarok, but every rider deserves a proper sword, and I can think of no better sword for the son of Morzin than Morzin's own blade." The elf woman glanced up at Aragon from underneath her lined brow. Understand me, Shadeslayer, I would prefer it if you had kept hold of Zarok, but it would please me even more if you had a sword that was made of it. Zarok may have served you well, but it was the wrong shape for your body. And do not even speak to me of deep blade. You would have to be a fool to think you could wield it. As you can see, said Aragon, I did not bring it with me from Lord Theola. Runan nodded and resumed chiseling. Well then, good. If Zarok is the right sword for Murtaugh, said Aragon, wouldn't Brahm's sword be the right weapon for me? A frown pinched Runan's eyebrows together. Unbiter, why would you think of Brahm's blade? Because Brahm was my father, said Aragon, and felt a thrill at being able to say that. Is that so now? Laying down her hammer and chisel, Runan walked out from under the roof of her forge until she stood opposite Aragon. Her posture was slightly stooped from the centuries she had spent hunched over her work, and because of it, she appeared an inch or two shorter than me. MMH, yes, I can see the similarity. He was a rude one. He was, Brahm, he said what he meant and wasted no words. I rather liked it. I cannot abide how my race has become. They are too polite, too refined, too precious. Ah, I remember when elves used to laugh and fight like normal creatures. Now they have become so withdrawn, some seem to have no more emotion than a marble statue. Saphira said, are you referring to how elves were before our races joined themselves to one another? Runan turned her scowl onto Saphira. Bright scales. Welcome. Yes, I was speaking of a time before the bond between elves and dragons was sealed. The changes I have seen in our races since, I hardly credit as possible, but so they are, and here I am, one of the few still alive who can remember what we were like before. Then Runan looked and gazed back to Aragon. Unbreaker is not the answer to your need. Brahm lost his sword during the fall of the Riders. If it does not reside in Galbatorix's collection, then it may have been destroyed or it may be buried in the earth somewhere, underneath the crumbling ruins of a long-forgotten battlefield. Even if it can be found, you could not retrieve it before you would have to face your enemies again. What, then, should I do, Runanelda? Asked Aragon, and he told her of the falchion he had chosen when he was among the Varden and of the spells he had reinforced the falchion with and of how it had failed him in the tunnels underneath Farthendur. Runan snorted. No, that would never work. Once a blade has been forged and quenched, you can protect it with an endless array of spells, but the metal itself remains as weak as ever. A rider needs something more, a blade that can survive the most violent of impacts and one that is unaffected by most any magic. No, what you must do is sing spells over the hot metal while you are extracting it from the ore and also while you are forging it, so as to alter and improve the structure of the metal. How can I get such a sword, though? Aragon asked. Would you make me one, Runanelda? The wire-thin lines on Runan's face deepened. She reached over and rubbed her left elbow, the thick muscles in her bare forearm writhing. You know that I swore that I would never create another weapon so long as I live. I do. My oath binds me. I cannot break it, no matter how much I might wish to. Continuing to hold her elbow, Runan walked back to her bench and sat before her sculpture. And why should I, Dragon Rider? Tell me that. Why should I loose another Soul Reaver upon the world? Choosing his words with care, Aragon said, because if you did, you could help put an end to Galbatorix's reign. Would not it be fitting if I killed him with a blade you forged when it was with your swords he and the Forsworn slew so many dragons and riders? You hate how they have used your weapons. How better to balance the scales, then, than by forging the instrument of Galbatorix's doom? Runan crossed her arms and looked up at the sky. A sword, a new sword. After so long, to again ply my craft. Lowering her gaze, she jutted her chin out at Aragon and said, it is possible, just possible, that there might be a way I could help you, but it is futile to speculate for I cannot try. Why not? Asked Saphira. Because I have not the metal I need. Runan growled. You do not think that I forged the riders, swords out of ordinary steel, do you? No, long ago, while I was wandering through the welp I happened upon fragments of a shooting star that had fallen to the earth. The pieces contained an ore unlike any I had handled before, and so I returned with it to my forge, and I refined it, and I discovered that the mix of steel that resulted was stronger, harder, and more flexible than any of earthly origin. I named the metal bright steel, on account of its uncommon brilliance, and when Queen Tarmanora asked me to forge the first of the riders' swords, it was bright steel I used. Thereafter, whenever I had the opportunity, I would search the forest for more fragments of the star metal. I did not often find any, but when I did, I would save them for the riders. Over the centuries, the fragments became ever more rare, until at last I began to think none were left. It took me 24 years to find the last deposit. From it, I forged 7 swords, among them Undbiter and Zarok. Since the riders fell, I have searched for bright steel only once more, and that was last night, after Oromis spoke to me about you. Runan tilted her head, and her watery eyes bored into Aragon. I wandered far and wide, and I cast many spells of finding and binding, but I came across not a single speck of bright steel. If some could be procured, then we might begin to consider a sword for you, Shadeslayer. Otherwise, this discussion is no more than pointless blathering. Aragon bowed to the elf woman and thanked her for her time, then he and Saphira left the atrium through the green leafy tunnel of power. As they walked side by side toward a glade from which Saphira could take off, Aragon said, "Bright steel, that has to be what Solembum meant. There must be bright steel underneath the Menno tree." How would he know? Perhaps the tree told him herself. Does it matter? Bright steel or not, she said, how are we supposed to get at anything that the roots of the Menno tree cover? We cannot chop through them. We do not even know where to chop. I have to think about it. From the glade by Runan's house, Saphira and Aragon flew over Elsmera back to the crags of Telnair, where Oromis and Glader were waiting. Once Saphira had landed and Aragon climbed down, she and Glader leapt off the cliff and spiraled high overhead, not really going anywhere, but rather enjoying the pleasure of each other's presence. While the 2 dragons danced among the clouds, Oromis taught Aragon how a magician could transport an object from one place to another without having the object traverse the intervening distance. Most forms of magic, said Oromis, require ever more energy to sustain as the distance between you and your target increases. However, that is not the case in this particular instance. It would require the same amount of energy to send the rock in my hand to the other side of that stream as it would to send it all the way to the Southern Isles. For that reason, the spell is most useful when you need to transport an item with magic across a distance so vast, it would kill you to move it normally through space. Even so, it is a demanding spell, and you should only resort to it if all else has failed. To shift something as large as Saphira's egg, for example, would leave you too exhausted to move. Then Oromis taught Aragon the wording of the spell and several variations on it. Once he had memorized the incantations to Oromis's satisfaction, the elf had him attempt to shift the small rock he was holding. As soon as Aragon uttered the spell in its entirety, the rock vanished from the palm of Oromis's hand and, an instant later, reappeared in the middle of the clearing with a flash of blue light, a loud detonation, and a surge of burning hot air. Aragon flinched from the noise and then gripped the branch of a nearby tree to steady himself as his knees buckled and cold crept over his limbs. His scalp tingled as he gazed at the rock, which lay in a circle of charred and flattened grass, and he remembered the moment when he had first beheld Saphira's egg. "Well done," said Oromis. "Now, can you tell me why the stone made that sound when it materialized in the grass?" Aragon paid close attention to everything Oromis said, but throughout the lesson, he continued to ponder the question of the Menno tree, even as he knew Saphira did as she soared high above. The longer he considered it, the more he despaired of ever finding a solution. When Oromis had finished teaching him how to shift objects, the elf asked, "Since you have declined Lord Fielder's offer of Tamerlane, will you and Saphira stay in Elsmera much longer?" "I don't know, Master," replied Aragon. "There is something more I wish to try with the Menno tree, but if it does not succeed, then I suppose we will have no choice but to depart for the bargain empty-handed." Oromis nodded. "Before you leave, return here with Saphira one last time." "Yes, Master." As Saphira winged her way toward the Menno tree with Aragon on her back, she said, "It didn't work before. Why should it now? It will work because it must. Besides, do you have a better idea?" "No, but I like it not. We do not know how she might react. Remember, before Linnea sang herself into the tree, she killed the young man who betrayed her affections. She might resort to violence again. She won't dare, not while you are there to protect me." MMH. With a faint whisper of wind, Saphira alighted upon a knuckle-like root several hundred feet from the base of the Menno tree. The squirrels in the enormous pine screamed warnings to their brethren as they noticed her arrival. Sliding down onto the root, Aragon rubbed his palms on his thighs, then muttered, "Right, let's not waste time." With light footsteps, he ran up the root to the trunk of the tree, holding his arms out on either side to maintain his balance. Saphira followed at a slower pace, her claws splitting and cracking the bark she trod over. Aragon squatted on a slippery patch of wood and hooked his fingers through a crevice in the trunk of the tree in order to keep himself from toppling over. He waited until Saphira was standing above him, and then he closed his eyes, breathed deeply of the cool, moist air, and pushed his thoughts out toward the tree. The Menoa tree made no attempt to stop him from touching her mind, for her consciousness was so large and alien, and so intertwined with that of the other plant life of the forest, it did not need to defend itself. Anyone who attempted to seize control of the tree would also have to establish their mental dominance over a large swath of the Weldengarden, a feat which no single person could hope to achieve. From the tree, Aragon felt a sense of warmth and light and of the earth pressing against her roots for hundreds of yards in every direction. He felt the stir of a breeze through the tree's tangled branches and the flow of sticky sap seeping over a small cut in its bark, and he received a host of similar impressions from the other plants the Menoa tree watched over. Compared with the awareness it had displayed during the Blood Oath celebration, the tree almost seemed to be asleep. The only sentient thought Aragon could detect was so long and slow-moving, it was impossible to decipher. Summoning all of his resources, Aragon flung a mental shout at the Menoa tree. "Please, listen to me, O great tree. I need your help. The entire land is at war, the elves have left the safety of Weldengarden, and I do not have a sword to fight with. The werecat Solembum told me to look under the Menoa tree when I needed a weapon. Well, that time has come. Please, listen to me, O Mother of the Forest. Help me in my quest." While he spoke, Aragon pressed against the tree's consciousness images of Thorn and Murdaugh in the armies of the Empire. Adding several more memories to the mix, Saphira bolstered his efforts with the force of her own mind. Aragon did not rely on words and images alone. From within himself and Saphira, he funneled a steady stream of energy into the tree, a gift of good faith that he hoped might also rouse the Menoa tree's curiosity. Several minutes elapsed, and still the tree did not acknowledge them, but Aragon refused to abandon their attempt. The tree, he reasoned, moved at a slower pace than humans or elves. It was only to be expected that it would not immediately respond to their request. "We cannot spare much more of our strength," said Saphira, "not if we are to return to the Varden in a timely fashion." Aragon agreed and reluctantly stemmed the flow of energy. While they continued to plead with the Menoa tree, the sun reached its zenith and then began to descend. Clouds billowed and shrank and scuttled across the dome of the sky. Birds darted over the trees, angry squirrels chattered, butterflies meandered from spot to spot, and a line of red ants marched past Aragon's booth, carrying small white larvae in their pincers. Then Saphira snarled, and every bird within hearing fled in fright. "Enough of this groveling," she declared. "I am a dragon, and I will not be ignored, not even by a tree." "No, wait," Aragon cried, sensing her intentions, but she ignored him. Stepping back from the trunk of the Menoa tree, Saphira crouched, sank her claws deep into the root underneath her, and, with a mighty wrench, tore 3 huge strips of wood out of the root. "Come out and speak with us, elf tree," she roared. She drew back her head like a snake about to strike, and a pillar of flame erupted from between her jaws, bathing the trunk in a storm of blue and white fire. Covering his face, Aragon leapt away to escape the heat. "Saphira, stop," he shouted, horrified. "I will stop when she answers us." A thick cloud of water droplets fell to the ground. Looking up, Aragon saw the branches of the pine trembling and swaying with increasing agitation. The groan of wood rubbing against wood filled the air. At the same time, an ice-cold breeze struck Aragon's cheek, and he thought he felt a low rumble beneath his feet. Glancing around, he saw that the trees that ringed the clearing seemed taller and more angular than before, and they seemed to be leaning inward, their crooked branches reaching toward him like talons. And Aragon was afraid. "Saphira," he said, and sank into a half-crouch, ready to either run or fight. Closing her jaws and thus ending the stream of fire, Saphira looked away from the Menoa tree. As she beheld the ring of menacing trees, her scales rippled and the tips rose from her hide like the ruff on a wild cat. She growled at the forest, swinging her head from side to side, then unfolded her wings and began to retreat from the Menoa tree. "Quick, get on my back." Before Aragon could take a single step, a root as thick as his arm sprouted out of the ground and coiled itself around his left ankle, immobilizing him. Even thicker roots appeared on either side of Saphira and grasped her by the legs and tail, holding her in place. Saphira roared in fury and arched her neck to loose another deluge of fire. The flames in her mouth flickered and went out as a voice sounded in her mind and Aragon's, a slow, whispering voice that reminded Aragon of rustling leaves, and the voice said, "Who dares to disturb my peace? Who Who dares to bite me and burn me? Name yourselves, so I will know who it is I have killed. Aragon grimaced in pain as the root tightened around his ankle. A little more pressure and it would break the bone. I am Aragon Shadowslayer, and this is the dragon with whom I am bonded, Saphira Brightscales. Die well, Aragon Shadowslayer and Saphira Brightscales. Wait, Aragon said. I have not finished naming us. A long silence followed, then the voice said, continue. I am the last free dragon rider in Algesia, and Saphira is the last female dragon in all of existence. We are perhaps the only ones who can defeat Galbatorix, the traitor who has destroyed the riders and conquered Algesia. Why did you hurt me, dragon? The voice sighed. Saphira bared her teeth as she answered, because you would not talk with us, Elf-Tree, and because Aragon has lost his sword and a werecat told him to look under the Menoa tree when he needed a weapon. We have looked and looked, but we cannot find it on our own. Then you die in vain, dragon, for there is no weapon under my roots. Desperate to keep the tree talking, Aragon said, we believe the werecat might have meant Brightsteel, the star metal Runan uses to forge the blades of the riders. Without it, she cannot replace my sword. The surface of the earth rippled as the network of roots that covered the clearing shifted slightly. The disturbance flushed hundreds of panicked rabbits, mice, voles, shrews, and other small creatures from their burrows and dens, and sent them scampering across the open ground toward the main body of the forest. Out of the corner of his eye, Aragon saw dozens of elves running toward the clearing, their hair streaming behind them like silk pennants. Silent as apparitions, the elves stopped underneath the boughs of the encircling trees and stared at him and Saphira but made no move to approach or to assist them. Aragon was about to call with his mind for Oromis and later when the voice returned. The werecat knew whereof he spoke. There is a nodule of bright steel ore buried at the very edge of my roots, but you shall not have it. You bit me and you burned me, and I do not forgive you. Alarm tempered Aragon's excitement at hearing of the ore's existence. But Saphira is the last female dragon. He exclaimed, surely you would not kill her. Dragons breathe fire, whispered the voice, and a shudder ran through the trees at the edge of the clearing. Fires must be extinguished. Saphira growled again and said, if we cannot stop the man who destroyed the dragon riders, he will come here and he will burn the forest around you, and then he will destroy you as well, Elf-Tree. If you help us, though, we may be able to stop him. A screech echoed among the trees as two branches scraped against each other. If he tries to kill my seedlings, then he will die, said the voice. No one is as strong as the whole of the forest. No one can hope to defeat the forest, and I speak for the forest. Is not the energy we gave you enough to repair your wounds? Asked Aragon. Is not it compensation enough? The Menoa tree did not answer but rather probed at Aragon's mind, sweeping through his thoughts like a gust of wind. What are you, rider? Said the tree. I know every creature that lives among this forest, but never have I encountered one like you. I am neither elf nor human, said Aragon. I am something in between. The dragons changed me during the Blood Oath celebration. Why did they change you, rider? So that I could better fight Galbatorix and his empire. I remember I felt a warping in the world during the celebration, but I did not think it was important. So little seems important now, save the sun and the rain. Aragon said, we will heal your root and trunk if that will satisfy you, but please, may we have the bright steel. The other trees creaked and moaned like abandoned souls, and then, soft and fluttering, the voice came again. Will you give me what I want in return, Dragon Rider? I will, Aragon said without hesitation. Whatever the price, we would gladly pay it for a rider's sword. The canopy of the Menoa tree grew still, and for several minutes, all was quiet in the clearing. Then the ground began to shake and the roots in front of Aragon began to twist and grind, shedding flakes of bark as they pulled aside to reveal a bare patch of dirt, out of which emerged what appeared to be a lump of corroded iron roughly 2 feet long and a foot and a half wide. As the ore came to rest on the surface of the rich black soil, Aragon felt a slight twinge in his lower belly. He winced and rubbed at the spot, but the momentary flare of discomfort had already vanished. Then the root around his ankle loosened and retreated into the ground, as did those that had been holding so nearly in place. Here's your medal, whispered the Menoa tree. Take it and go, Ellipsis. But, Aragon started to ask. Go, said the Menoa tree, its voice fading away. Go, and the tree's consciousness withdrew from him and Saphira, receding deeper and deeper into itself until Aragon could barely sense its presence. Around them, looming pines relaxed and resumed their usual positions. But, Aragon said out loud, puzzled that the Menoa tree had not told him what she wanted. Still perplexed, he went over to the oar, slid his fingers under the edge of the metal-laced stone, and hoisted the irregular mass into his arms, grunting at its weight. Hugging it against his chest, he turned away from the Menoa tree and started the long walk toward Runan's house. Saphira sniffed the bright steel as she joined him. "You were right," she said. "I should not have attacked her." "At least we got the bright steel," said Aragon, "and the Menoa tree. Well, I don't know what she got, but we have what we came for, and that's what matters." The elves gathered alongside the path Aragon had chosen to follow and gazed at Aragon and Saphira with an intensity that made Aragon quicken his pace and the skin on the nape of his neck. Not once did the elves speak, only stared with their slanting eyes, stared as if they were watching a dangerous animal stalk through their hearts. A puff of smoke billowed from Saphira's nostrils. "If Galbatorix does not kill us first," she said, "I think we shall live to regret this." Mind over metal. Where did you find that? Demanded Runan as Aragon staggered into the atrium of her house and dropped the lump of bright steel ore onto the ground by her feet. In as few words as possible, Aragon explained about Solembum and the Menoa tree. Squatting next to the ore, Runan caressed the pitted surface, her fingers lingering over the metallic patches interspersed among the stone. "You were either very foolish or very brave to test the Menoa tree as you did. She is not one to trifle with." "Is there enough ore for a sword?" Saphira asked. "Several swords, if past experience is anything to judge by," said Runan, rising to her full height. The elf woman glanced at her forge in the center of the atrium, then clapped her hands together, her eyes lighting up with a combination of eagerness and determination. "Let us to it, then. You need a sword, Shadeslayer. Very well, I shall give you a sword the likes of which has never been seen before in Algesia." "But what of your oath?" Aragon asked. "Think not of it for the time being. When must the two of you return to the Varden?" "We should have left the day we arrived," said Aragon. Runan paused, her expression introspective. "Then I shall have to hurry that which I do not normally hurry and use magic to craft that which would otherwise require weeks of work by hand. You and Brightscales will help me." It was not a question, but Aragon nodded in agreement. "We shall not rest tonight, but I promise you, Shadeslayer, you shall have your sword by tomorrow morning." Bending at the knees, Runan lifted the ore from the ground without discernible effort and carried it to the bench with her carving in progress. Aragon removed his tunic and shirt, so he would not ruin them during the work to come, and in their place Runan gave him a tight-fitting jerkin and a fabric apron treated so that it was impervious to fire. Runan wore the same. When Aragon asked her about gloves, she laughed and shook her head. "Only a clumsy smith uses gloves." Then Runan led him to a low, grotto-like chamber set within the trunk of one of the trees out of which her house was grown. Inside the chamber were bags of charcoal and loose piles of whitish clay bricks. By means of a spell, Aragon and Runan lifted several hundred bricks and carried them outside, next to the open-walled forge, then did the same with the bags of charcoal, each of which was as large as a man. Once the supplies were arranged to Runan's satisfaction, she and Aragon built a smelter for the ore. The smelter was a complex structure, and Runan refused to use much magic to construct it, so the project took them most of the afternoon. First they dug a rectangular pit 5 feet deep, which they filled with layers of sand, gravel, clay, charcoal, and ash, and in which they embedded a number of chambers and channels to wick away moisture that would otherwise dampen the heat of the smelting fire. When the contents of the pit were level with the ground, they assembled a trough of bricks on top of the layers below, using water and unfired clay as their mortar. Ducking inside her house, Runan returned with a pair of bellows, which they attached to holes at the base of the trough. They broke then to drink and to eat a few bites of bread and cheese. After the brief repast, Runan placed a handful of small branches in the trough, lit them on fire with a murmured word, and, when the flames were well set, laid medium-sized pieces of seasoned oak along the bottom. For nearly an hour, she tended the fire, cultivating it with the care of a gardener growing roses, until the wood had burned down to an even bed of coals. Then Runan nodded to Aragon and said, "Now." Aragon lifted the lump of ore and gently lowered it into the trough. When the heat on his fingers became unbearable, he released the ore and jumped back as a fountain of sparks swirled upward like a swarm of fireflies. On top of the ore and the coals, he shoveled a thick blanket of charcoal as fuel for the fire. Aragon brushed the charcoal dust from his palms, then grasped the handles of one set of bellows and began began to pump it, as did Runen the bellows on the other side of the smelter. Between them, they supplied the fire with a steady stream of fresh air so that it burned ever hotter. The scales on Saphira's chest, as well as on the underside of her head and neck, sparkled with dazzling flashes of light as the flames in the smelter danced. She crouched several yards away, her eyes fixed upon the molten heart of the fire. I could help with this, you know, she said. It would take me but a minute to melt the ore. Yes, said Runen, but if we melt it too quickly, the metal will not combine with the charcoal and become hard and flexible enough for a sword. Save your fire, dragon. We shall need it later. The heat from the smelter and the effort of pumping the bellows soon had Aragon covered in a sheen of sweat, his bare arms shone in the light from the fire. Every now and then, he or Runen would abandon the bellows to shovel a thin layer of charcoal over the fire. The work was monotonous, and as a result, Aragon soon lost track of the time. The constant roar of the fire, the feel of the bellows, handle in his hands, the whoosh of rushing air, and Saphira's vigilant presence were the only things he was aware of. It came as a surprise to him, then, when Runen said, that should be sufficient. Leave the bellows. Wiping his brow, Aragon helped as she shoveled the incandescent coals out of the smelter and into a barrel filled with water. The coals sizzled and emitted an acrid smell as they struck the liquid. When they finally exposed the glowing pool of white-hot metal at the bottom of the trough, the slag and other impurities having run off during the process, Runen covered the metal with an inch of fine white ash, then leaned her shovel against the side of the smelter and went to sit on the bench by her forge. What now? Aragon asked as he joined her. Now we wait. For what? Runen gestured toward the sky, where the light from the setting sun painted a tattered array of clouds red and purple and gold. It must be dark when we work the metal if we are to correctly judge its color. Also, the bright steel needs time to cool so that it will be soft and easy to shape. Reaching around behind her head, Runen undid the cord that held back her hair, then gathered up her hair again and retied the cord. In the meantime, let us talk about your sword. How do you fight, with one hand or two? Aragon thought for a minute, then said, it varies. If I have a choice, I prefer to wield a sword with one hand and carry a shield with my other. However, circumstances have not always been favorable to me, and I have often had to fight without a shield. Then I like being able to grip the hilt with both hands, so I can deliver a more powerful stroke. The pommel on Zarok was large enough to grasp with my left hand if I had to, but the ridges around the ruby were uncomfortable and they did not afford me a secure hold. It would be nice to have a slightly longer hilt. I take it you do not want a true two-handed sword? Said Runen. Aragon shook his head. No, it would be too big for fighting indoors. That depends upon the size of the hilt and the blade combined, but in general, you are correct. Would you be amenable to a hand-and-a-half sword instead? An image flashed in Aragon's mind of Murtaugh's original sword, and he smiled. Why not? Thought Aragon. Yes, a hand-and-a-half sword would be perfect, I think. And how long would you like the blade? No longer than Zarok's. MMH. Do you want a straight blade or a curved blade? Straight. Have you any preferences as to the guard? Not especially. Crossing her arms, Runen sat with her chin touching her breastbone, her eyes heavy-lidded. Her lips twitched. What of the width of the blade? Remember, no matter how narrow it is, the sword shall not break. Perhaps it could be a little wider at the guard than Zarok was. Why? I think it might look better. A harsh, cracked laugh broke from Runen's throat. But how would that improve the use of the sword? Embarrassed, Aragon shifted on the bench, at a loss for words. Never ask me to alter a weapon merely in order to improve its appearance, admonished Runen. A weapon is a tool, and if it is beautiful, then it is beautiful because it is useful. A sword that could not fulfill its function would be ugly to my eyes no matter how fair its shape, not even if it were adorned with the finest jewels and the most intricate engraving. The elf woman pursed her lips, pushing them out as she thought. So, a sword equally suited for the unrestrained bloodshed of a battlefield as it is for defending yourself in the narrow tunnels under Farthendur.
Welcome.
A sword for all occasions, of middling length, but for the hilt, which shall be longer than average. A sword for killing Galbatorix, said Aragon. Runen nodded, and as such, it must be well protected against magic. Her chin sank to her chest again. Armor has improved a great deal in the past century, so the tip will need to be narrower than I used to make them, the better to pierce plate and mail and to slip into the gaps between the various pieces. MMH. From a pouch by her side, Runan withdrew a knotted piece of twine, with which she took numerous measurements of Aragon's hands and arms. Afterward, she retrieved a wrought iron poker from the forge and tossed it toward Aragon. He caught it with one hand and raised an eyebrow at the elf woman. She motioned toward him with a finger and said, "Go on now. Up on your feet and let me see how you move with a sword." Walking out from under the roof of the open-walled forge, Aragon obliged her by demonstrating several of the forms Brahm had taught him. After a minute, he heard the clink of metal on stone, then Runan coughed and said, "Oh, this is hopeless." She stepped in front of Aragon, holding another poker. Her brow furrowed with a fierce scowl as she raised the poker before her in a salute and shouted, "Have it you, Shadeslayer." Runan's heavy poker whistled through the air as she swung at him with a strong slashing blow. Dancing to the side, Aragon parried the attack. The poker jumped in his hand as the two rods of metal collided. For a brief while, he and Runan sparred. Although it was obvious she had not practiced her swordsmanship for some time, Aragon still found her a formidable opponent. At last they were forced to stop because the soft iron of the pokers had bent until the rods were as crooked as the branches of a yew tree. Runan collected Aragon's poker, then carried the two mangled pieces of metal over to a pile of broken tools. When she returned, the elf woman lifted her chin and said, "Now I know exactly what shape your sword should have. But how will you make it?" A twinkle of amusement appeared in Runan's eyes. "I won't. You shall make the sword instead of me, Shadeslayer." Aragon gaped at her for a moment, then sputtered and said, "Me? But I was never apprenticed to a blacksmith or a bladesmith. I have not the skill to forge even a common brush knife." The twinkle in Runan's eyes brightened. "Nevertheless, you shall be the one to make this sword. But how? Will you stand beside me and give me orders as I hammer the metal?" "Hardly," said Runan. "No, I shall guide your actions from within your mind so that your hands may do what mine cannot. It is not a perfect solution, but I can think of no other means of evading my oath that will also allow me to ply my craft." Aragon frowned. "If you move my hands for me, how is that any different from making the sword yourself?" Runan's expression darkened. In a brusque voice, she said, "Do you want this sword or not, Shadeslayer?" "I do." "Then refrain from pestering me with such questions." "Hardly," said Runan. "No, I shall guide your actions from within your mind so that your hands may do what mine cannot. It is not a perfect solution, but I can think of no other means of evading my oath that will also allow me to ply my craft." Aragon frowned. "If you move my hands for me, how is that any different from making the sword yourself?" Runan's expression darkened and, in a brusque voice, she said, "Do you want this sword or not, Shadeslayer?" "I do." "Then refrain from pestering me with such questions. Making the sword through you is different because I think it is different. If I believed otherwise, then my oath would prevent me from participating in the process. So, unless you wish to return to the Varden empty-handed, you would be wise to remain silent on the subject." "Yes, Runan Elda." They went to the smelter then, and Runan had Saphira pry the still warm mass of congealed bright steel from the bottom of the brick trough. "Break it into fist-sized pieces," Runan directed, and withdrew to a safe distance. Lifting her front leg, Saphira stamped upon the rippled beam of bright steel with all her strength. The earth shook, and the bright steel cracked in several places. 3 more times Saphira stamped upon the metal before Runan was satisfied with the results. The elf woman gathered up the short lumps of metal and Ray Runan carried them to a low table next to the forge. There she sorted the metal according to its hardness, which, or so she told Aragon, she was able to determine by the color and texture of the fractured metal. "Some is too hard and some is too soft," she said, "and while I could remedy that if I wanted to, it would require another heating. So we will only use the pieces that are already suitable for a sword. On the edges of the sword will go though a slightly harder steel, she touched a cluster of pieces that had a brilliant, sparkling grain, the better to take a keen edge. The middle of the sword shall be made of a slightly softer steel. She touched a cluster of pieces that were grayer and not so bright, the better to bend and to absorb the shock of a blow. Before the metal can be forged into shape, though, it must be worked to rid it of the remaining impurities. How is that done? Asked Saphira. That you shall see momentarily. Runan went to one of the poles that supported the roof of the forge, sat with her back against it, crossed her legs, and closed her eyes, her face still and composed. Are you ready, Shadeslayer? She asked. I am, said Aragon, despite the tension gathered in his belly. The first thing Aragon noticed about Runan as their minds met was the low chords that echoed through the dark and tangled landscape of her thoughts. The music was slow and deliberate and cast in a strange and unsettling key that scraped on his nerves. What it implied about Runan's character, Aragon was not sure, but the eerie melody caused him to reconsider the wisdom of allowing her to control his flesh. But then he thought of Saphira sitting next to the forge, watching over him, and his trepidation receded, and he lowered the last of the defenses around his consciousness. It felt to Aragon like a piece of raw wool sliding over his skin as Runan enveloped his mind with hers, insinuating herself into the most private areas of his being. He shivered at the contact and almost withdrew from it, but then Runan's rough voice sounded within his skull, Relax, Shadeslayer, and all shall be well. Yes, Runan Elda. Then Runan began to lift his arms, shift his legs, roll his head, and otherwise experiment with the abilities of his body. Strange as it was for Aragon to feel his head and limbs move without his direction, it was stranger still when his eyes began to flick from place to place, seemingly of their own accord. The sensation of helplessness kindled a burst of sudden panic within Aragon. When Runan walked him forward and his foot struck the corner of the forge and it seemed as if he were going to fall, Aragon immediately reasserted command over his faculties and grabbed the horn of Runan's anvil to steady himself. Do not interfere, snapped Runan. If your nerve fails you at the wrong moment during the forging, you could cause yourself irreparable harm. So could you if you're not careful, Aragon retorted. Be patient, Shadeslayer. I shall have mastered this by the time it is dark. While they waited for the last of the light to fade from the velvet sky, Runan prepared the forge and practiced wielding various tools. Her initial clumsiness with Aragon's body soon disappeared, although once she reached for a hammer and rammed the tips of his fingers into the top of the table. The pain made Aragon's eyes water. Runan apologized and said, Your arms are longer than mine. A few minutes later, when they were about to begin, she commented, It is fortunate you have the speed and strength of an elf, Shadeslayer, else we would have no hope of finishing this tonight. Taking the pieces of hard and soft bright steel she had decided to use, Runan placed them into the forge. At the elf's request, Saphira heated the steel, opening her jaws only a fraction of an inch so that the blue and white flames that poured from her mouth remained focused in a narrow stream and did not spill over into the rest of the workshop. The roaring pillar of fire illuminated the entire atrium with a fierce blue light and made Saphira's scales sparkle and flash with blinding brilliance. Runan had Aragon remove the bright steel from the torrent of flames with a pair of tongs once the metal began to glow cherry red. She laid it on her anvil and, with a series of quick blows from a sledgehammer, flattened the lumps of metal into plates that were no more than a quarter of an inch thick. The surface of the red-hot steel glittered with incandescent motes. As she finished with each plate, Runan dropped it into a nearby trough of brine. Having flattened all of the bright steel, Runan pulled the plates out of the trough, the brine warm against Aragon's arm, and scoured each plate with a piece of sandstone to remove the black scales that had formed on the surface of the metal. The scouring exposed the crystalline structure of the metal, which Runan examined with great attentiveness. She further sorted the metal by relative hardness and purity according to the qualities the crystals displayed. Aragon was privy to Runan's every thought and feeling, by reason of their closeness. The depth of her knowledge amazed him. She saw things within the metal he had not suspected existed, and the calculations she made concerning its treatment were beyond his understanding. He also sensed she was dissatisfied with how she had handled the sledgehammer while flattening the steel. Runan's dissatisfaction continued to grow until she said, Bah! Look at these dents in the metal. I cannot forge a blade like this. My control over your arms and hands is not fine enough to craft a sword worthy of note. Before Aragon could attempt to reason with her, Saphira said, The tools do not the artist make, Runan Elda. Surely you would find a way to compensate for this inconvenience. Inconvenience, snorted Runan. I have no more coordination than a fledgling. I am a stranger in a stranger's house. She did not explain the solution to either Aragon or Saphira but, one by one, placed the plates of steel on the anvil and cracked them into flakes no wider than rose petals. Gathering up half the flakes of the harder bright steel, Runan stacked them into a brick, which she then coated with clay and birch bark to hold them together. The brick went on a thick steel paddle with a 7-foot-long handle, similar to those used by bakers to insert and remove loaves of bread from a hot oven. Runan laid the end of the paddle in the center of the forge and then backed Aragon as far away as she could and still have him hold on to the handle. Then she asked Saphira to resume breathing fire, and again the atrium glowed with a flickering blue radiance. The heat was so intense, Aragon felt as if his exposed skin were crisping, and he saw that the granite stones of which the forge was made had acquired a bright yellow glow. The bright steel could easily have taken over half an hour to reach the appropriate temperature in a charcoal fire, but it required only a few minutes in the withering inferno of Saphira's flames before it turned white. The moment it did, Runan ordered Saphira to cease breathing fire. Darkness engulfed the forge as Saphira closed her jaws. Rushing Aragon forward, Runan had him transport the glowing brick of clay-covered steel to the anvil, where she seized a hammer and welded the disparate flakes of bright steel into a cohesive whole. She continued to pound on the metal, elongating it out into a bar, then made a cut in the middle, folded the metal back on itself, and welded the two pieces together. The bell-like peals of ringing metal echoed off the ancient trees that surrounded the atrium. Runan had Aragon return the bright steel to the forge once its color had faded from white to yellow, and again Saphira bathed the metal with the fire from her belly. 6 times Runan heated and folded the bright steel, and each time the metal became smoother and more flexible, until it could bend without tearing. As Aragon hammered the steel, his every action dictated by Runan, the elf woman began to sing, both with his tongue and her own. Together, their voices formed an unpleasant harmony that rose and fell with the beats of the hammer. A tingle crawled down Aragon's spine as he felt Runan channel a steady flow of energy into the words they were mouthing, and he realized that the song contained spells of making, shaping, and binding. With their voices too, Runan sang of the metal that lay on the anvil, describing its properties, altering them in ways that exceeded Aragon's understanding, and imbuing the bright steel with complex enchantments designed to give it strength and resilience beyond that of any ordinary metal. Of Aragon's hammer arm Runan also sang, and under the gentle influence of her crooning, every blow she struck with his arm landed upon its intended target. Runan quenched the bar of bright steel after the 6th and final fold was complete. She repeated the entire process with the other half of the hard bright steel, forging an identical bar to the first. Then she gathered up the fragments of the softer steel, which she folded and welded 10 times before forming it into a short, heavy wedge. Next, Runan had Saphira reheat the 2 bars of harder steel. Runan lay the shining rods side by side on her anvil, grasped both of them at either end with a pair of tongs, and then twisted the rods around each other 7 times. Sparks shot into the air as she hammered upon the twists to weld them into a single piece of metal. The resulting mass of bright steel Runan folded, welded, and pounded back out to length another 6 times. When she was pleased with the quality of the metal, Runan flattened the bright steel into a thick rectangular sheet, cut the sheet in half lengthwise with a sharp chisel, and bent each of the 2 halves down their middle, so they were in the shape of long, shallow V's. And all that, Aragon estimated, Runan was able to accomplish within the course of an hour and a half. He marveled at her speed, even though it was his own body that carried out the tasks. Never before had he seen a smith-shaped metal with such ease. What would have taken horse-hours took her only minutes. And yet no matter how demanding the forging was, Runan continued to sing, weaving a fabric of spells within the bright steel and guiding Aragon's arm with infallible accuracy. Amid the frenzy of noise, fire, sparks, and exertion, Aragon thought he glimpsed, as Runan raked his eyes across the forge, a trio of slender figures standing by the edge of the atrium. Saphira confirmed his suspicion a moment later when she said, "Aragon, we are not alone." "Who are they?" he asked. Saphira sent him an image of the short, wizened werecat Maud, in human form, standing between 2 pale elves who were no taller than she. One of the elves was male, the other female, and they were both extraordinarily beautiful, even by the standards of the elves. Their solemn teardrop faces seemed wise and innocent in equal measure, which made it impossible for Aragon to judge their age. Their skin displayed a faint, silvery sheen, as if the 2 elves were so filled with energy, it was seeping out of their very flesh. Aragon queried Runan as to the identity of the elves when she paused to allow his body a brief rest. Runan glanced at them, affording him a slightly better view. Then, without interrupting her song, she said with her thoughts, "They are Alana and Dusan, the only elf children in Elsberry. There was much rejoicing when they were conceived 12 years ago. They are like no other elves I have met," he said. "Our children are special, Shadeslayer. They are blessed with certain gifts of grace and gifts of power, which no grown elf can hope to match. As we age, our blossom withers somewhat, although the magic of our early years never completely abandons us." Runan wasted no more time talking. She had Aragon place the wedge of bright steel between the two V-shaped strips and hammer on them until the strips nearly enveloped the wedge and friction held the three pieces together. Then Runan welded the pieces into a hole, and while the metal was still hot, she began to draw it out and form a rough blank of the sword. The soft wedge became the spine of the blade, while the two-parter strips became the sides, edges, and point. Once the blank was nearly as long as the finished sword, the work slowed as Runan returned to the tang and carefully hammered her way up the blade, establishing the final angles and proportions. Runan had Saphira heat the blade in segments of no more than 6 or 7 inches at a time, which Runan arranged by holding the blade over one of Saphira's nostrils, through which Saphira would release a single jet of fire. A host of writhing shadows fled toward the perimeter of the atrium every time the fire sprang into existence. Aragon watched with amazement as his hands transformed the crude lump of metal into an elegant instrument of war. With every blow, the outline of the blade became clearer, as if the bright steel wanted to be a sword and was eager to assume the shape Runan desired. At last the forging came to a close, and there on the anvil lay a long black blade, which, although it was still rough and incomplete, already radiated a sense of deadly purpose. Runan allowed Aragon's tired arms to rest while the blade cooled by air, then she had Aragon take the blade to another corner of her workshop, where she had arranged 6 different grinding wheels and, on a small bench, a wide assortment of files, scrapers, and a brace of stones. She fixed the blade between 2 blocks of wood and spent the next hour planing the sides of the sword with a draw knife, as well as refining the contours of the blade with files. As with the hammering, every stroke of the draw knife and every scrape of a file seemed to have twice the effect it normally would.
Yeah.
It was as if the tools knew exactly how much steel to remove and would remove no more. When she was done filing, Runan built a charcoal fire in her forge, and while she waited for the fire to mature, she mixed a slurry of dark, fine-grained clay, ash, powdered pumice, and crystallized juniper sap. She painted the blade with the concoction, slathering twice as much on the spine as she did along the edges and by the point. The thicker the solution of clay, the slower the underlying metal would cool when it was quenched and, as a result, the softer that area of the sword would become.
Good.
The clay lightened as Runan dried it with a quick incantation. At the direction of the elf woman, Aragon went to the forge. He lay the sword flat upon the bed of scintillating coals and, pumping the bellows with his free hand, slowly pulled it toward his hip. Once the tip of the blade came free of the fire, Runan turned it over and repeated the sequence. She continued to draw the blade through the coals until both edges had acquired an even orange tone and the spine of the sword was bright red in color. Then, with a single smooth motion, Runan lifted the sword from the coals, swept the glowing bar of steel through the air, and plunged it into the trough of water next to the forge. An explosive cloud of steam erupted from the surface of the water, which hissed and sizzled and bubbled around the blade. After a minute, the boiling water subsided, and Runan withdrew the now pearl-gray sword. Returning into the fire, she brought the whole sword to the same low heat, so as to reduce the brittleness of the edges, and then quenched it once more. Aragon had expected Runan to relinquish her hold on his body after they had forged, hardened, and tempered the blade, but to his surprise, she remained in his mind and continued to control his limbs. Runan had him douse the forge, then she walked Aragon back to the bench with the files and scrapers and a brace of stones. There she sat him, and making use of ever finer stones, she polished the blade. From her memories, Aragon learned that she would normally spend a week or more polishing a blade, but because of the song they sang, she, through him, was able to complete the task in a mere 4 hours, in addition to carving a narrow groove down the middle of each side of the blade. As the bright steel grew smoother, the true beauty of the metal was revealed. Within it, Aragon could see a shimmering, cable-like pattern, every line of which marked the transition between 2 layers of the velvety steel. And along each edge of the sword was a rippling, silvery white band as wide as his thumb, which made it appear as if the edges burned with tons of frozen fire. The muscles in Aragon's right arm gave way as Runan was covering the tang with decorative cross-hatching, and the file he was holding slipped off the tang and fell from his fingers. The extent of his exhaustion surprised him, for he had been concentrating upon the sword to the exclusion of all else. Enough, said Runan, and she removed herself from Aragon's mind without further ado. Shocked by her sudden absence, Aragon swayed on his seat and nearly lost his balance before he regained control over his rebellious limbs. But we're not finished, he protested, turning toward Runan. The night sounded unnaturally quiet to him without the strains of their extended duet. Runan rose from where she had been sitting cross-legged against the pole and shook her head. I have no more need of you, Shadeslayer. Go and dream until dawn. But you are tired, and even with my magic, you are liable to ruin the sword if you continue to work on it. Now that the blade is done, I can attend to the rest without interference from my oath, so go. You will find a bed on the second floor of my house. If you are hungry, there is food in the pantry. Aragon hesitated, reluctant to leave, then nodded and shambled away from the bench, his feet dragging in the dirt. As he passed her, he ran a hand over Saphira's wing and bade her good night, too weary to say more. In return, she tousled his hair with a warm puff of air and said, I shall watch and remember for you, little one. Aragon paused on the threshold of Runan's house and looked across the shadowy atrium to where Maud and the two elf children were still standing. He raised a hand in greeting, and Maud smiled at him, baring her sharp, pointed teeth. A tingle crawled down Aragon's neck as the elf children gazed at him. Their large, slanted eyes were slightly luminous in the gloom. When they made no other motion, he ducked his head and hurried inside, eager to lie down upon a soft mattress. A rider in full. Wait, little one, said Saphira. The sun has risen and Runan is impatient. Aragon bolted upright, throwing off his blankets as easily as he cast off his waking dreams. His arms and shoulders were sore from his exertions of the previous day. He pulled on his boots, fumbling with the laces in his excitement, grabbed his grimy apron from the floor, and bounded down the elaborately carved stairs to the entryway of Runan's curved house. Outside, the sky was bright with the first light of dawn, although shadows still enveloped the atrium. Aragon spotted Runan and Saphira by the open-walled forge and trotted over to them, combing his hair into place with his fingers. Runan stood leaning against the edge of the bench. There were dark bags under her eyes, and the lines on her face were heavier than before. The sword lay before her, concealed beneath a length of white cloth. I have done the impossible, she said, her words hoarse and broken. I made a sword when I swore I would not. What is more, I made it in less than a day and with hands that were not my own. Yet the sword is not crude or shoddy. No, it is the finest sword I have ever forged. I would have preferred to use less magic during the process, but that is my only qualm, and it is a small one compared with the perfection of the results. Behold. Grasping the corner of the cloth, Runan pulled it aside, revealing the sword. Aragon gasped. He had thought that in the handful of hours since he had left her, Runan would only have had enough time to fabricate a plain hilt and crossguard for the sword, and maybe a simple wooden scabbard. Instead, the sword Aragon saw on the bench was as magnificent as Zarok, Nagling, and Tamerlane and, in his opinion, more beautiful than any of them. Covering the blade was a glossy scabbard of the same dark blue as the scales on Saphira's back. The color displayed a slight variegation, like the mottled light at the bottom of a clear forest pond. A piece of blue bright steel carved in the shape of a leaf capped the end of the scabbard while a collar decorated with stylized lines encircled the mouth. The curved crossguard was also made of blue bright steel, as were the four ribs that held in place the large sapphire that formed the pommel. The hand and aim hilt was made of hard black wood. Overcome by a sense of reverence, Aragon reached out toward the sword, then paused and glanced at Runan. May I? He asked. She inclined her head. You may. I give it to thee, Shadeslayer. Aragon lifted the sword from the bench. The scabbard and the wood of the hilt were cool to the touch. For several minutes, he marveled at the details on the scabbard and the guard and the pommel. Then he tightened his grip around the hilt and unsheathed the blade. Like the rest of the sword, the blade was blue, but of a slightly lighter shade. It was the blue of the scales in the hollow of Saphira's throat rather than the blue of those on her back. And as it was on Zarok, the color was iridescent. As Aragon moved the sword about, the color would shimmer and shift, displaying any of the many tones of blue present on Saphira herself. Through the wash of color, the cable-like patterns within the bright steel and the pale bands along the edges were still visible. With a single hand, Aragon swung the sword through the air, and he laughed at how light and fast it felt. The sword almost seemed alive. He grasped the sword with both his hands then and was delighted to find that they fit perfectly on the longer hilt. Lunging forward, he stabbed at an imaginary enemy and was confident they wouldn't die from the attack. "Here," said Runin, and pointed at a bundle of 3 iron rods planted upright in the ground outside the forge. "Try it on those." Aragon allowed himself a moment to focus his thoughts, then took a single step toward the rods. With a yell, he slashed downward and cut through all 3 rods. The blade emitted a single pure note that slowly faded into silence. When Aragon examined the edge where it had struck the iron, he saw that the impact had not damaged it in the slightest. "Are you well pleased, Dragon Rider?" Runin asked. "More than pleased, Runin Elda," said Aragon, and bowed to her. "I do not know how I can thank you for such a gift. You may thank me by killing Galbatorix. If there is any sword destined to slay that mad king, it is this one. I shall try my hardest, Runin Elda." The elf woman nodded, appearing satisfied. "Well, you finally have a sword of your own, which is as it ought to be. Now you are truly a dragon rider." "Yes," said Aragon, and held the sword up toward the sky, admiring it. "Now I am truly a rider. Before you leave, one last thing remains for you to do," said Runin. "Oh." She flicked a finger toward the sword. "You must name it so I can mark the blade and scabbard with the appropriate glyph." Aragon walked over to Saphira and said, "What do you think?" "I am not the one who must carry the blade. Name it as you see fit." "Yes, but you must have some ideas." She lowered her head toward him and sniffed at the sword, then said, "Blue Gem Tooth is what I would name it. Or Blue Claw Red. That would sound ridiculous to humans. Then what of Reaver or Gootripper? Or maybe Battleclaw or Glitterthorn or Limbacker? You could name it Terror or Pain or Armbiter or Eversharp or Ripplescale, that on account of the lines in the steel. There is also Tongue of Death and Elfsteel and Star Metal and many others besides." Her sudden outpouring surprised Aragon. "You have a talent for this," he said. "Inventing random names is easy. Inventing the right name, however, can try the patience of even an elf." "What of King Killer?" he asked. "And what if we actually kill Galbatorix? What, then? Will you do nothing else of worth with your sword?" MMH. Placing the sword alongside Saphira's left foreleg, Aragon said, "It's exactly the same color as you. I could name it after you." A low growl sounded in Saphira's chest. "No." He fought back a smile. "Are you sure? Just imagine if we were in battle and..." Her claws sank into the earth. "No, I am not a thing for you to wave about and make fun of." "No, you're right, I'm sorry. Well, what if I named it Hope in the ancient language? Zarok means misery, so wouldn't it be fitting if I were to wield a sword that by its very name would counteract misery?" "A noble sentiment," said Saphira. "But do you really want to give your enemies hope? Do you want to stab Galbatorix with hope?" "It's an amusing pun," he said, chuckling. "Once, maybe, but no more." Stymied, Aragon grimaced and rubbed his chin, studying the play of light across the glittering blade. As he gazed into the depths of the steel, his eye chanced upon the flame-like pattern that marked the transition between the softer steel of the spine and that of the edges, and he recalled the word Brahm had used to light his pipe during the memories Saphira had shared with him. Then Aragon thought of Yazuak, where he had first used magic, and also of his duel with Durza in Farth and Duer, and in that instant he knew without doubt that he had found the right name for his sword. Aragon consulted with Saphira, and when she agreed with his choice, he lifted the weapon to shoulder level and said, "I am decided. Sword, I name thee Brisinger." And with a sound like rushing wind, the blade burst into fire, an envelope of sapphire blue flames writhing about the razor-sharp steel. Uttering a startled cry, Aragon dropped the sword and jumped back, afraid of being burned. The blade continued to blaze on the ground, the translucent flames charring a nearby clump of grass. It was then that Aragon realized it was he who was providing the energy to sustain the unnatural fire. He quickly ended the magic, and the fire vanished from the sword. Puzzled by how he could have cast a spell without intending to, he picked up the sword again and tapped the blade with the tip of a finger. It was no hotter than before. A heavy scowl on her brow, Runin stopped forward, seized the sword from Aragon, and examined it from tip to pommel. "You are fortunate I have already protected it with wards against heat and damage, else you would have just scratched the part of the steel tip of the blade. Do not drop the sword again, Shadeslayer, even if it should turn into a snake, or else I shall take it back and give you a worn-out hammer instead. Aragon apologized, and appearing somewhat mortified, Runan handed the sword back to him. Did you set fire to it on purpose? She asked. No, said Aragon, unable to explain what had happened. Say it again, ordered Runan. What? The name, say it again. Holding the sword as far away from his body as he could, Aragon exclaimed, rising her. A column of flickering flames engulfed the blade of the sword, forming Aragon's face. This time Aragon noticed a slight drain on his strength from the spell. After a few moments, he extinguished the smokeless fire. Once more Aragon exclaimed, rising her, and once more the blade shimmered with blue, made like tongues of flame. Now there is a fitting sword for a rider and dragon, said Saphira in a delighted tone. It breathes fire as easily as I do. But I wasn't trying to cast a spell, protested Aragon. All I did was say Brisinger and he yelped and swore as the sword again caught fire, which he put out for the 4th time. May I? Asked Runan, extending a hand toward Aragon. He gave her the sword, and she too said, Brisinger. A shiver seemed to run down the blade, but other than that, it remained inanimate. Her expression contemplative, Runan returned the sword to Aragon and said, I can think of 2 explanations for this marvel. One is that because you were involved with the forging, you imbued the blade with a portion of your personality and therefore it has become attuned to your wishes. My other explanation is that you have discovered the true name of your sword. Perhaps one of those things are what has happened. In any event, you have chosen well, Shadeslayer. Brisinger. Yes, I like it. It is a good name for a sword. A very good name, Saphira agreed. Then Runan placed her hand over the middle of Brisinger's blade and murmured an inaudible spell. The elvish glyph for fire appeared upon both sides of the blade. She did the same to the front of the scabbard. Again Aragon bowed to the elf woman, and both he and Saphira expressed their gratitude to her. A smile appeared on Runan's aged face, and she touched each of them upon their brows with her thumb's thumb. I am glad I was able to help the riders this once more. Go, Shadeslayer. Go, Bright Scales. Return to the Varden, and may your enemies flee with fear when they see the sword you now wield. So Aragon and Saphira bade her farewell, and together they departed Runan's house, Aragon cradling Brisinger in his arms as he would a newborn child. Greaves and bracers. A single candle lit the inside of the grey wool tent, a poor substitute for the radiance of the sun. Roran stood with his arms outstretched while Katrina laced up the sides of the padded jerkin she had fitted for him. When she finished, she tugged on the hem of the jerkin, smoothing out the wrinkles, and said, There now. Is it too tight? He shook his head. No. She retrieved his greaves from the cot they shared and knelt before him in the flickering candlelight. Roran watched as she buckled the greaves onto his lower legs. She cupped the curve of his calf with her hand as she secured the second piece of armor, her flesh warm against his through the fabric of his trousers. Standing, she turned to the cot again and picked up his bracers. Roran held out his arms toward her and stared into her eyes, even as she stared into his. With slow, deliberate motions, she fastened the bracers onto his forearms, then drew her hands from the inside of his elbow down to his wrists, where he clasped her hands with his own. She smiled and pulled free of his gentle grip. Next from the cot, she took his shirt of mail. She rose up onto the tips of her toes and lifted the hauberk over his head and held it there while he fit his arms into the sleeves. The mail tinkled like ice as she released it and it fell onto his shoulders, unfurling so that the lower edge hung level with his knees. On his head, she set his leather arming cap, tying it firmly in place with a knot under his chin. She held his face between her hands for a moment, then kissed him once upon the lips and fetched his peaked helm, which she carefully slid over the arming cap. Roran slipped his arm around her thickening waist as she started back toward the cot, stopping her. Listen to me, he said. I'll be fine. He tried to convey all his love for her through the tone of his voice and the strength of his gaze. Don't just sit here all alone. Promise me that. Go to Elaine. She could use your help. She's sick, and her child is overdue. Katrina lifted her chin, her eyes gleaming with tears he knew she would not shed until after he had left. Must you march in the front line? She whispered. Someone must, and it might as well be me. Whom would you send in my stead? Anyone at all. Katrina looked down and was silent for a span, then she removed a red kerchief from the bodice of her dress and said, Carry this this favor of mine, so that the whole world may know how proud I am of you." And she tied the kerchief to his sword belt. Roran kissed her twice and released her, and she fetched his shield and spear from the cot. He kissed her a third time as he took them from her, then put his arm through the strap on his shield. "If something does happen to me," he began to say. Katrina placed a finger upon his lips. "Shish, speak not of it, lest it should come true." "Very well." He hugged her one last time. "Be safe. And you." Although he hated to leave her, Roran raised his shield and strode out of the tent into the pale light of dawn. Men, dwarves, and Urgles streamed westward through the camp, heading toward the trampled field where the Barden were assembling. Roran filled his lungs with the cool morning air and then followed, knowing that his band of warriors would be waiting for him. Once he arrived at the field, he sought out Jormunder's division and, after reporting to Jormunder, made his way to the front of the group, where he chose to stand next to Yarbog. He glanced at him, then grunted, "A good day for a battle." A good day. A horn sounded at the forefront of the Barden as soon as the sun broke over the horizon. Roran hefted his spear and began to run forward, like everyone else around him, howling at the top of his lungs as arrows rained down upon him and boulders whistled past overhead, flying in either direction. Ahead of him, a stone wall 80 feet tall loomed. The siege of Finster had begun. Taking its house, Saphira and Aragon flew back to their treehouse. Aragon gathered up his belongings from the bedroom, saddled Saphira, and then returned to his usual place upon the crest of her shoulders. "Before we go to the crags of Telnair," he said, "there is one more thing I must do in Elsmera." "Must you?" she asked. "I won't be content unless I do." Saphira leapt out from the treehouse. She glided westward until the number of buildings began to diminish, and then she angled downward for a soft landing upon an area of moss-covered path. After asking and getting directions from an elf who was sitting in the branches of a nearby tree, Aragon and Saphira continued through the woods until they arrived at a small one-room house grown out of the bole of a fir tree that stood at an acute angle, as if a constant wind pressed against it. To the left of the house was a soft bank of earth taller by several feet than Aragon. A rivulet of water tumbled over the edge of the bank and poured itself into a limpid pool before meandering off into the dim recesses of the forest. White orchids lined the pool. A bulbous root protruded out of the ground from among the slender flowers that grew along the near shore, and sitting cross-legged upon the pool was Sloane. Aragon held his breath, not wanting to lure the man to his presence. The butcher wore robes of brown and orange, after the fashion of the elves. A thin black strip of cloth was tied around his head, concealing the gaping holes where his eyes had been. In his mouth, he held a length of seasoned wood, which he was whittling with a small, curved knife. His face was covered with far more lines than Aragon remembered, and upon his hands and arms were several new scars, livid against the surrounding skin. "Wait here," Aragon said to Saphira, and slipped off her back. As Aragon approached him, Sloane paused in his carving and cocked his head. "Go away," he rasped. Not knowing how to respond, Aragon stopped where he was and remained silent. The muscles in his jaw rippling, Sloane removed another few curls from the wood he held, then tapped the tip of his knife against the root and said, "Blast you. Can you not leave me alone with my misery for a few hours? I don't want to listen to any bard or minstrel of yours, and no matter how many times you ask me, I won't change my mind. Now go on. Away with you." Pity and anger welled up inside Aragon, and also a sense of displacement at seeing a man he had grown up around, and had so often feared and disliked, brought to such a state. "Are you comfortable?" Aragon asked in the ancient language, adopting a light, lilting tone. Sloane uttered a growl of disgust. "You know I cannot understand your tongue and I do not wish to learn it. The words ring in my ears longer than they ought to. If you will not speak in the language of my race, then do not speak to me at all." Despite Sloane's entreaty, Aragon did not repeat the question in their common language, nor did he depart. With a curse, Sloane resumed his whittling. After every other stroke, he ran his right thumb over the surface of the wood, checking the progress of whatever he was carving. Several minutes passed, and then in a softer voice, Sloane said, "You were right, having something to do with my hands haunts my thoughts. Sometimes I can almost forget what I have lost, but the memories always return, and I feel as if I am choking on them. I am glad you sharpened the knife. A man's knives should always be sharp." Aragon watched him for a minute more, then he turned away and walked back to where Saphira was waiting. As he pulled himself into the saddle, he said, his mind does not seem to have changed very much. And Saphira replied, you cannot expect him to become someone else entirely in such a short time. No, but I had hoped he would learn something of wisdom here in Elsmera and that maybe he would repent of his crimes. If he does not wish to acknowledge his mistakes, Aragon, nothing can force him to. In any event, you have done all you can for him. Now he must find a way to reconcile himself with his lot. If he cannot, then let him seek the solace of the everlasting grave. From a clearing close to Sloane's house, Saphira launched herself up and over the surrounding trees and headed north toward the crags of Telnair, flapping as hard and fast as she could. The morning sun sat full upon the horizon, and the rays of light that streamed out over the treetops created long, dark shadows that, as one, pointed to the west like purple pennants. Saphira descended toward the clearing by Oromas's pinewood house, where Glader and Oromas stood waiting for them. Aragon was startled to see that Glader was wearing a saddle nestled between two of the towering spikes on his back and that Oromas was garbed in heavy traveling robes of blue and green, over which he wore porcelain and golden scale armor, as well as bracers upon his arms. A tall, diamond-shaped shield was slung across his back, an archaic helm rested in the crook of his left arm, and around his waist was mounted his bronze-colored sword, Nagling. With a gust of wind from her wings, Saphira alighted upon the sword of grass and clover. She flicked out her tongue, tasting the air as Aragon slid to the ground. Are you going to fly with us to the Varden? She asked. The tip of her tail twitched with excitement. We shall fly with you as far as the edge of Duweldenvarden, but there our paths must part, said Oromas. Disappointed, Aragon asked, will you return to Elsmera then? Oromas shook his head. No, Aragon, then we shall continue onward to the city of Gilead. Saphira hissed with surprise, a sentiment Aragon shared. Why to Gilead? He asked, bewildered. Because Icelandzadi and her army have marched there from Sunan, and they are about to lay siege to the city, said Glader. The strange, gleaming structures of his mind brushed against Aragon's consciousness. But do not you and Oromas wish to keep your existence hidden from the Empire? Saphira asked. Oromas closed his eyes for a moment, his expression withdrawn and enigmatic. The time for hiding has passed, Saphira. Glader taught the two of you everything we could in the brief while you were able to study under us. It was a paltry education compared with that you would have received given how events press on us. We are fortunate to have been able to teach you as much as we did. Glader and I are satisfied that you now know everything that might help you to defeat Galbatorix. Therefore, since it seems unlikely that either of you will have a chance to return here for further instruction before the conclusion of this war, and since it seems even more unlikely that there shall ever be another dragon and rider for us to instruct while Galbatorix still bestrides the warm earth, we have decided that we no longer have any reason to remain sequestered in Duweldenvarden. It is more important that we help Icelandzadi and the Varden overthrow Galbatorix than we tarry here in idle comfort while we wait for another rider and dragon to seek us out. When Galbatorix learns that we are still alive, it shall undermine his confidence, for he shall not know if other dragons and riders have survived his attempt to exterminate them. Also, knowledge of our existence shall bolster the spirits of the dwarves and the Varden and counteract any adverse effects Murtaugh and Thorn's appearance on the burning plains may have had upon the resolution of their warriors. And it may well increase the number of recruits Nasuda receives from the Empire. Aragon glanced at Nagling and said, surely, though, Master, you do not intend to venture into battle yourselves. And why should we not? Inquired Oromas, tilting his head to one side. Since he did not want to offend Oromas or Glader, Aragon was uncertain how to respond. At last he said, forgive me, Master, but how can you fight when you cannot cast spells that require more than a small amount of energy? And what of the spasms you sometimes suffer? If one were to strike in the middle of a battle, it could prove fatal. Oromas replied, as you ought to know well by now, mere strength rarely decides the victor when two magicians duel. Even so, I have all the strength I need here, in the jewel of my sword. And he reached across his body and placed the palm of his right hand on the yellow diamond that formed the pommel of Nagling. For over 100 years, Glader and I have stored every iota of our excess strength in this diamond, and others have added their strength to the pool as well. Twice a week, several elves from Elsmera visit me here and transfer as much of their life force into the gem as they can without killing themselves. The amount of energy contained within this stone is formidable, Aragon. With it, I could shift an entire mountain. It is a small matter, Then, to defend Glader and myself from swords and spears and arrows, or even from a boulder cast by a siege engine. As for my seizures, I have attached certain wards to the stone and nagling that will protect me from harm if I become incapacitated upon the battlefield. So you see, Aragon, Glader and I are far from helpless. Chastened, Aragon dipped his head and murmured, "Yes, master." Oromus's expression softened somewhat. "I appreciate your concern, Aragon, and you are right to be concerned, for war is a perilous endeavor and even the most accomplished warrior may find death waiting for him amid the heated frenzy of battle. However, our cause is a worthy one. If Glader and I go to our deaths, then we go willingly, for by our sacrifice, we may help to free Algesia from the shadow of Galbatorix's tyranny." "But if you die," said Aragon, feeling very small, "and yet we still succeed in killing Galbatorix and freeing the last dragon egg, who will train that dragon and his rider?" Oromus surprised Aragon by reaching out and clasping him by the shoulder. "If that should come to pass," said the elf, his face grave, "then it shall be your responsibility, Aragon, and yours, Saphira, to instruct the new dragon and rider in the ways of our order." "Ah, do not look so apprehensive, Aragon. You would not be alone in the task. No doubt Icelandzadi and Nasuda would ensure that the wisest scholars of both our races would be there to help you." A strange sense of unease troubled Aragon. He had often longed to be treated as more of an adult, but nevertheless, he did not feel ready to take Oromus's place. It seemed wrong to even contemplate the notion. For the first time, Aragon understood that he would eventually become part of the older generation, and that when he did, he would have no mentor to rely upon for guidance. His throat tightened. Releasing Aragon's shoulder, Oromus gestured at Freisinger, which lay in Aragon's arms, and said, "The entire forest shuddered when you broke the Mennoa tree, Saphira, and half the elves in Elsmera contacted Glader and me with frantic pleas for us to rush to your aid. Moreover, we had to intervene on your behalf with Gilderian the Wise, so as to prevent him from punishing you for employing such violent methods." "I shall not apologize," said Saphira. "We had not the time to wait for gentle persuasion to work." Oromus nodded. "I understand, and I am not criticizing you, Saphira. I only wanted you to be aware of the consequences of your actions." At his request, Aragon handed his newly forged sword to Oromus and held his helm for him while the elf examined the sword. "Runin has outdone herself," Oromus declared. "Few weapons, swords and weapons, are equal to this. You are fortunate to wield such an impressive blade, Aragon." One of Oromus's sharp eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch as he read the clip on the blade. Freisinger, a most apt name for the sword of a dragon rider. "Aye," said Aragon, "but for some reason, every time I utter its name, the blade bursts into—" He hesitated, and instead of saying fire, which, of course, was Brisingar in the ancient language, he said, "flames." Oromus's eyebrow climbed even higher. Indeed, did Runin have an explanation for this unique phenomenon? As he spoke, Oromus returned Freisinger to Aragon in exchange for his helm. "Yes, master," said Aragon. And he recounted Runin's two theories. When he had finished, Oromus murmured, "I wonder," and his gaze drifted past Aragon toward the horizon. Then Oromus gave a brief shake of his head and again focused his gray eyes upon Aragon and Saphira. His face became even more solemn than before. "I am afraid I have let my pride speak for me. Glader and I may not be helpless, but neither, as you pointed out, Aragon, are we entirely whole. Glader has his wound, and I have my own, impairments. It is not for nothing I am called the cripple or his whole. Our disabilities would not be a problem if our only enemies were mortal men. Even in our current state, we could easily slay 100 ordinary humans, 100 or 1,000, it would matter little which. However, our enemy is the most dangerous foe this land has ever faced. As much as I dislike acknowledging it, Glader and I are at a disadvantage, and it is quite possible that we shall not survive the battles yet to come. We have lived long and full lives, and the sorrows of centuries press upon us, but the two of you are young and fresh and full of hope, and I believe your prospects of defeating Galbatorix are greater than those of anyone else." Oromus glanced at Glader, and the elf's face became troubled. "Therefore, in order to help ensure your survival, and as a precaution against our possible demise, Glader has, with my blessing, decided to—" "I have decided," said Glader, "to give you my heart of hearts, Saphira Brightscales, Aragon Shadowslayer." Saphira's astonishment was no less than Aragon's. Together, they stared at the majestic gold dragon who towered high above them. Saphira said, "Master, You honor us beyond words, but, are you sure that you wish to entrust your heart to us? I am sure, said Glader, and lowered his massive head until it was only slightly above Aragon. For many reasons, I am sure. If you hold my heart, you shall be able to communicate with Oromus and me, no matter how far apart we may be, and I shall be able to aid you with my strength whenever you are in difficulty. And if Oromus and I should fall in battle, our knowledge and experience, and also my strength, shall still be at your disposal. Long have I pondered this choice, and I am confident it is the right one. But if Oromus were to die, said Aragon in a soft voice, would you really want to live on without him, and as an Eldenari? Glader turned his head and focused one of his immense eyes upon Aragon. I do not wish to be parted from Oromus, but whatever happens, I shall continue to do what I can to topple Galbatorix from his throne. That is our only goal, and not even death shall deter us from pursuing it. The idea of losing Saphira horrifies you, Aragon, and rightly so. However, Oromus and I have had centuries to reconcile ourselves with the fact that such a parting is inevitable. No matter how careful we are, if we live long enough, eventually one of us will die. It is not a happy thought, but it is the truth. Such is the way of the world. Shifting his stance, Oromus said, I cannot pretend that I regard this with favor, but the purpose of life is not to do while we wonder what needs to be done. This is what fate demands of us. So now I ask you, said Glader, Saphira Brightscales and Aragon Shadeslayer, will you accept my gift and all that it entails? I will, said Saphira. I will, replied Aragon after a brief hesitation. Then Glader drew back his head. The muscles of his abdomen rippled and clenched several times, and his throat began to convulse, as if something were stuck in it. Widening his stance, the gold dragon extended his neck straight out in front of him, every cord and sinew of his body standing in high relief underneath the armor of his sparkling scales. Blair's throat continued to flex and relax with increasing speed until at last he lowered his head so that it was level with Aragon and opened his jaws, hot, pungent air pouring from his massive maw. Aragon squinted and tried not to gag. As he gazed into the depths of Blair's mouth, Aragon saw the dragon's throat contract one last time, and then a hint of gold light appeared between the folds of dripping, blood-red tissue.
Hello, good
A second later,
hunter.
a round object about a foot in diameter slid down Blair's crimson tongue and out of his mouth so fast, Aragon nearly missed catching it. As his hands closed around the slippery, saliva-covered Eldenari, Aragon gasped and staggered backward, for he suddenly felt Blair's every thought and emotion, and all of the sensations of his body. The amount of information was overwhelming, as was the closeness of their contact. Aragon had expected as much, but it still shocked him to realize he was holding Blair's entire being between his hands. Glader flinched, shaking his head as if he had been stung, and quickly shielded his mind from Aragon, although Aragon could still sense the flicker of his shifting thoughts, as well as the general color of his emotions. The Eldenari itself was like a giant gold jewel. Its surface was warm and covered with hundreds of sharp facets, which varied somewhat in size and sometimes projected at odd, slanting angles. The center of the Eldenari glowed with a dull radiance, similar to that of a shuttered lantern, and the diffuse light throbbed with a slow, steady beat. Upon first inspection, the light appeared uniform, but the longer Aragon gazed at it, the more details he saw within it. Small eddies and currents that coiled and twisted in seemingly random directions, darker motes that barely moved at all, and flurries of bright flashes no larger than the head of a pin that would flare for a moment, then fade back into the underlying field of light. It was alive. Here, said Oromus, and handed Aragon a sturdy cloth sack. To Aragon's relief, his connection with Glader vanished as soon as he placed the Eldenari in the bag and his hands were no longer touching the gem-like stone. Still somewhat shaken, Aragon clasped the cloth-covered Eldenari against his chest, awed by the knowledge that his arms were wrapped around Blair's essence and afraid of what might happen to it if he allowed the heart of hearts out of his grasp. Thank you, Master, Aragon managed to say, bowing his head toward Glader. We shall guard your heart with our lives, Saphira added. No, exclaimed Oromus, his voice fierce. Not with your lives. That is the very thing we wish to avoid. Do not allow any misfortune to befall Glair's heart because of carelessness on your part, but neither should you sacrifice yourself to protect him or me or anyone else. You have to stay alive at all costs, else our hopes shall be dashed and all will be darkness. Yes, Master, Aragon and Saphira said at the same time, he with his tongue and she with her thoughts. Said Glader, because you swore fealty to Nasuda, and you owe her your loyalty and obedience. says, you may tell her of my heart if you must, but only if you must. For the sake of dragons everywhere, what few of us remain, the truth about the Eldenari cannot become common knowledge. May we tell Arya? Asked Saphira. And what about Blodgarm and the other elves Icelandsati sent to protect me? Asked Aragon. I allowed them into my mind principle, and at last moment. They will notice your presence, later, if you help us in the midst of a battle. You may inform Blodgarm and his spellcasters of the Eldenari, said Blader, but only after they have sworn oaths of secrecy to you. Oromis placed his helm on his head. Arya is Icelandsati's daughter, and so I suppose it is proper she should know. However, as with Masuda, do not tell her unless it becomes absolutely necessary. A secret shared is no secret at all. If you can be so disciplined, do not even think of it, nor of the very fact of the Eldenari, so that no one may steal the information from your minds. Yes, Master. Now let us be gone from here, said Oromis, and drew a pair of thick gauntlets over his hands. I have heard from Icelandsati that Masuda has laid siege to the city of Finster, and the Varden have great need of you. We have spent too long in Elsmera, said Saphira. Perhaps, said Glader, but it was time well spent. Taking a short running start, Oromis bounded up Glader's single foreleg and onto his high, jagged back, where Oromis settled into his saddle and began to tighten the straps around his legs. As we fly, said the elf, calling down to Aragon, we can review the lists of true names you learned during your last visit. Aragon went to Saphira and carefully climbed onto her back, wrapped one of his blankets around Glader's heart, and packed the bundle in his saddlebags. Then he secured his legs in the same manner as had Oromis. Behind him, he could feel a constant thrum of energy radiating from the Eldenari. Glader walked to the edge of the crags of Telnire and unfurled his voluminous wings. The earth shook as the gold dragon leapt through the cloud-streaked sky, and the air boomed and shuddered as Glader drove his wings downward, pulling away from the ocean of trees below. Aragon gripped the spike in front of him as Saphira followed, flinging herself out into open space and falling several hundred feet in a steep dive before she ascended to Glader's side. Glader assumed the lead as the two dragons oriented themselves toward the southwest. Each of them flapping at a different tempo, Saphira and Glader sped over the rolling forest. Saphira arched her neck and uttered a ringing roar. Ahead, Glader responded likewise. Their fierce cries echoed across the vast dome of the sky, frightening the birds and beasts below. Flight. From Elsmera, Saphira and Glader flew without stopping over the ancient forest of the elves, soaring high above the tall, dark pine trees. Sometimes the forest would break, and Aragon would see a lake or a contorted river winding across the land. Often there was a herd of small roe deer gathered along the edge of the water, and the animals would stop and lift their heads to watch the dragons soar past. For the most part, however, Aragon paid little attention to the scenery because he was busy reciting within his mind the ancient language Oromis had taught him, and if he forgot any remaining mistake in pronunciation, Oromis would have him repeat the word until he had memorized it. They arrived at the edge of Weltengarden by late afternoon of the first day. There, above the shadowed boundary between the trees and the fields of grass beyond, Glader and Saphira circled one another, and Glader said, "Keep safe your heart, Saphira, and mine as well." "I will, Master," Saphira replied. And Oromis shouted from Glader's back, "Fair winds to you both, Aragon, Saphira. When next we meet, let it be before the gates of Uruibane." "Fair winds to you as well," Aragon called in return. Then Glader turned and followed the line of the forest westward, which would lead him to the northernmost tip of Icenstar Lake, and the lake thence to Gilead, while Saphira continued in the same southwesterly direction as before. Saphira flew all through that night, landing only to drink, and so Aragon could stretch his legs and relieve himself. Unlike during their flight to Elsmera, they encountered no headwinds. The air remained clear and smooth, as if even nature were eager for them to return to the Varden. When the sun rose on their second day, it found them already deep within the Hederag Desert and heading straight south, so as to skirt the eastern border of the Empire. And by the time darkness had again engulfed the land and sky and held them in its cold embrace, Saphira and Aragon were beyond the confines of the sandy wastes and were again soaring over the verdant fields of the Empire, their course such that they would pass between Uruibane and Lake Tudostan on their way to the city of Finster. After flying for 2 days and 2 nights without sleep, Saphira was unable to continue. Swooping down to a small thicket of white birch trees by a pond, she curled up in their shade and napped for a few hours while Aragon kept watch and practiced his swordsmanship with Freisinger. When the sun rose, Saphira, Aragon, and Glader, all 3 of them, were asleep. Saphira, Aragon, and Glader, all 3 of them, were asleep. Saphira, Aragon, and Glader, all 3 of them, were asleep. Saphira, Aragon, and Glader, all 3 of them, were asleep. Ever since they had parted with Oromus and Glader, a sense of constant anxiety had troubled Aragon as he pondered what awaited him in Saphira and Finster. He knew that they were better protected than most from death and injury, but when he thought back to the burning plains, and to the battle of Barthendur, and when he remembered the sight of blood spurting from severed limbs and the screams of wounded men and the white-hot lash of a sword slicing through his own flesh, then Aragon's gut would roil and his muscles would shake with suppressed energy, and he did not know whether he wished to fight every soldier in the land or flee in the opposite direction and hide in a deep, dark hole. His dread only worsened when he and Saphira resumed their journey and spotted lines of armed men marching over the fields below. Here and there, pillars of pale smoke rose from sacked villages. The sight of so much wanton destruction sickened him. Averting his gaze, he squeezed the next spike in front of him and squinted until the only thing visible through the bars of his blurry eyelashes was the white calluses on his knuckles. "Little one," said Saphira, her thoughts slow and tired. "We have done this before. Do not allow it to disturb you so." Regretting that he had distracted her from flying, he said, "I'm sorry. I'll be fine when we get there. I just want it to be over." "I know." Aragon sniffed and wiped his cold nose on the cuff of his tunic. "Sometimes I wish I enjoyed fighting as much as you do. Then this would be so much easier." "If you did," she said, "the entire world would cower before our feet, including Galbatorix. No, it is good you do not share my love of blood. We balance each other out, Aragon. Apart we are incomplete, but together we are whole. Now clear your mind of these poisonous thoughts and tell me a riddle that will keep me awake." "Very well," he said after a moment. "I am colored red and blue and yellow and every other hue of the rainbow. I am long and short, thick and thin, and I often rest coiled up. I can eat 100 sheep in a row and still be hungry. What am I? A dragon, of course," she said without hesitation. "No, a woolen rug." Bah. Their third day of traveling crept past with agonizing slowness. The only sounds were those of Saphira's wings flapping, the steady noise of her panting, and the dull roar of air rushing past Aragon's ears. His legs and lower back ached from sitting in the saddle for so long, but his discomfort was slight compared with Saphira's. Her flight muscles burned with an almost unbearable amount of pain. Still, she persevered and did not complain, and she refused his offer to alleviate her suffering with a spell, saying, "You will need the strength when we arrive." Hours after dusk, Saphira wobbled and dropped several feet in a single, sickening lurch. Aragon straightened, alarmed, and looked around for any clues as to what had caused the disturbance but saw only blackness below and the glittering stars above. "I think we just reached the giant river," said Saphira. "The air here is cool and moist, as it would be over water." "Then Finster shouldn't be much farther ahead. Are you sure you can find the city in the dark? We could be 100 miles north or south of it." "No, we could not. My sense of direction may not be infallible, but it is certainly better than yours or that of any other earthbound creature. If the elf maps we have seen were accurate, then we cannot be off by more than 50 miles north or south of Finster, and at this height, we can easily see the city over that distance. We may even be able to smell the smoke from their chimneys." And so it was. Later that night, when dawn was only a few hours away, a dull red glow appeared upon the western horizon. Seeing it, Aragon twisted around and removed his armor from the saddlebags, then donned his mail halberd, his arming cap, his helm, his bracers, and his greaves. He wished he had his shield, but he had left it with the Barden before running to Mount Thargor with Nargarsva. Then Aragon rummaged with one hand through the contents of his bags until he found the silver flask of Pyelder Oromus had given him. The metal container was cool to the touch. Aragon drank a small sip of the enchanted liqueur, which seared the inside of his mouth and which tasted of elderberries and mead and mulled cider. Heat suffused his face. Within seconds, his weariness began to recede as the restorative properties of the Pyelnerve took effect. Aragon shook the flask. To his concern, it felt as if a third of the precious liqueur was already gone, even though he had only consumed a single mouthful once before. "I have to be more careful with it in the future," he thought. As he and Saphira drew closer, the glow on the horizon resolved into thousands of individual points of light, from small handheld lanterns to cook fires to bonfires to huge patches of burning pitch that poured a foul black smoke into the night sky. By the ruddy light of the fires, Aragon saw a sea of flashing spear points and gleaming helmets surging against the base of the large, well-fortified city, the walls of which teemed with tiny figures busy firing arrows at the army below, pouring cauldrons of boiling oil between the merlons of the parapet, cutting ropes thrown over the walls, and pushing away the rickety wooden ladders the besiegers kept leaning against the ramparts. Faint calls and cries floated upward from the ground, as well as the boom of a battering ram crashing against the city's iron gates. The last of Aragon's weariness vanished as he studied the battlefield and noted the placement of the men and the buildings and the various pieces of war machinery. Extending outward from the walls of Finster were hundreds of ramshackle hovels crammed one against another, with hardly enough room for a horse to pass between. The dwellings of those two formed a house within the main part of the city. Most of the hovels appeared deserted, and a wide swath had been demolished so that the Varden could approach the city walls in force. A score or more of the mean huts were burning, and even as he watched, the fires spread, leaping from one thatched roof to another. East of the hovels, curved black lines scored the earth where trenches had been excavated to protect the Varden's camp. On the other side of the city were docks of yours similar to those Aragon remembered from Tyr, and then the dark and restless ocean that seemed to extend to infinity. A thrill of feral excitement ran through Aragon, and he felt Saphira shiver underneath him at the same time. He gripped the hilt of Brisinger. They don't seem to have noticed us yet. Shall we announce our arrival? Saphira answered him by loosing a roar that made his teeth rattle and by painting the sky in front of them with a thick sheet of blue fire. Below, the Varden at the foot of the city and the defenders upon the ramparts paused, and for a moment, silence enveloped the battlefield. Then the Varden began to cheer and bang their spears and swords against their shields while great groans of despair wafted from the people of the city. "Ah!" exclaimed Aragon, blinking. "I wish you hadn't done that. Now I can't see anything." "Sorry." Still blinking, he said, "The first thing we should do is find a horse that just died, or some other animal, so that I can replenish your strength with theirs." "You don't have." Saphira stopped talking as another mind touched theirs. After a half-second of panic, Aragon recognized the consciousness as that of Triana. "Aragon, Saphira," cried the sorceress, "you're just in time." Arya and another elf scaled the walls, but they were trapped by a large group of soldiers. "They won't survive another minute unless someone helps them. Hurry." Pressing R. Saphira tucked her wings close to her body and tipped into a steep dive, hurtling toward the dark buildings of the city. Aragon ducked his head against the blast of wind that tore at his face. The world spun around them as Saphira rolled to her right so that the archers on the ground would have difficulty shooting her. Aragon's limbs grew heavy as Saphira pulled out of the dive. Then she leveled out and the weight pressing down on him vanished. Like strange, shrieking hawks, arrows whistled past them, some missing their mark, while Aragon's wards deflected the rest. Swooping low over the outer city walls, Saphira roared again and lashed out with her claws and tail, knocking groups of screaming men off the parapet and toward the hard ground 80 feet below. A tall, square tower armed with 4 ballistas stood at the far end of the southern wall. The huge crossbows fired 12-foot-long javelins toward the Varden mass before the city gates. Inside the curtain wall, Aragon and Saphira spotted 100 or so soldiers gathered around a pair of warriors, who stood with their backs pressed against the base of the tower, desperately trying to fend off a thicket of thrusting blades. Even in the gloom and from high above, Aragon recognized one of the warriors as Arya. Saphira leapt down from the parapet and landed in the midst of the soldiers, crushing several men beneath her feet. The rest scattered, screaming with fear and surprise. Saphira roared, frustrated that her prey was escaping, and whipped her tail across the dirt, flattening a dozen more soldiers. A man tried to run past her. Fast as a striking snake, she caught him between her jaws and shook her head, snapping his spine. She disposed of another 4 in a similar manner. By then the remaining men had vanished among the buildings. Aragon quickly pulled loose his leg straps, then jumped to the ground. The additional weight of his armor drove him to one knee as he landed. He grunted and pushed himself up onto his feet. "Aragon!" cried Arya, running up to him. She was panting and drenched with sweat. Her only armor was a padded jerkin and a light helm painted black so it would not cast unwanted reflections. "Welcome, Yardscaler. Welcome, Shadeslayer," purred Blodgarm from by her side, his short fangs orange and glistening in the torchlight, his yellow eyes glowing. The ruff of fur on the elf's back and neck stood on end, which made him appear even fiercer than usual. Both he and Arya were stained with blood, although Aragon could not tell if the blood was theirs. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Arya shook her head, and Blodgarm said, "A few scratches, but nothing serious." "What are you doing here without reinforcements?" asked Saphira. "The gates," said Arya, gasping. For 3 days, we've tried to break them, but they're impervious to magic, and the battering ram has barely dented the wood. So I convinced Nasuda too. When Arya paused to regain her breath, Bloodgarm picked up the thread of her narrative. Arya convinced Nasuda to stage tonight's attack so that we could sneak into Finster without being noticed and open the gates from within. Unfortunately, we encountered a trio of spellcasters. They engaged us with their minds and prevented us from using magic while they summoned soldiers to overwhelm us with sheer numbers. While Bloodgarm spoke, Aragon placed a hand on the chest of one of the dead soldiers and transferred what energy remained in the man's flesh into his own body, and thence to Saphira. "Where are the spellcasters now?" he asked, proceeding to another corpse. Bloodgarm's fur-covered shoulders rose and fell. "They seem to have taken fright at your appearance, Shiratugal." "As well they should," growled Saphira. Aragon drained the energy from 3 more soldiers, and from the last, he also took the man's round wooden shield. "Well then," he said, standing, "let us go open the gates for the Varden, shall we?" "Yes, and without delay," said Arya. She started forward, then cast a sideways glance at Aragon. "You have a new sword." It was not a question. He nodded. "Runan helped me to forge it." "And what is the name of your weapon, Shadeslayer?" asked Bloodgarm. Aragon was about to answer when 4 soldiers ran out from the mouth of a dark alleyway, spears lowered. In a single, smooth motion, he drew Brisinger from its sheath and slashed through the haft of the lead man's spear and, continuing with the blow, decapitated the soldier. Brisinger seemed to shimmer with savage delight. Arya lunged forward and stabbed 2 of the other men before they could react while Bloodgarm leapt sideways and tackled the last soldier, killing him with his own dagger. "Hurry!" cried Arya, and started to run toward the city gates. Aragon and Bloodgarm raced after her while Saphira followed close behind, her claws loud against the paving stones of the street. Archers fired arrows at them from the parapet above, and 3 different times, soldiers rushed out from the main bulk of the city and flung themselves against them. Without slowing, Aragon, Arya, and Bloodgarm cut down the attackers, or else Saphira blasted them with a withering torrent of fire. The steady boom of the battering ram became ever louder as they approached the 40-foot-tall gates of the city. Aragon saw 2 men and a woman, who were garbed in dark robes, standing before the iron-bound doors, chanting in the ancient language and swaying from side to side with upheld arms. The 3 spellcasters fell silent when they noticed Aragon and his companions and, with their robes flapping, ran up the main street of Finster, which led to the keep at the far side of the city. Aragon longed to pursue them. However, it was more important to let the Varden into the city, where they would no longer be at the mercy of the men on the walls. "I wonder what mischief they have planned," he thought, worried as he watched the spellcasters depart. Before Aragon, Arya, Bloodgarm, and Saphira arrived at the gates, 50 soldiers in gleaming armor streamed out of the guard towers and positioned themselves in front of the huge wooden doors. One of the soldiers pounded the hilt of his sword against his shield and shouted, "Never shall you pass, foul demons. This is our home, and we shall not allow Urgles and elves and other inhuman monsters to enter. Be gone, for you shall find nothing but blood and sorrow in Finster." Arya pointed at the guard towers and murmured to Aragon, "The gears